How is everyone doing? It is your boy GZTV back with another video, and we are here to finally close out our X-Men marathon. We finally reached Dark Phoenix, one of the most infamous movies in this entire franchise, and obviously for the wrong reasons given its critical reception. Honestly, I do not really agree with the critical reception. I'm not even giving this movie the benefit of the doubt or trying to be a yes man for Marvel. I genuinely don't think this movie's as bad as people make it out to be. Coming off Apocalypse, expectations were not very high given how bad of a fucking movie that was. Surprisingly, again, this isn't as terrible as its reputation suggests. It's still not a particularly good movie. This is still not going to be a particularly positive review. It's more interesting than Apocalypse though, even when the execution doesn't match the ideas. This is another movie. It's a really good concept. Obviously, they're taking stuff from the comic books, not executed all that well. The story is actually one of the stronger aspects. Unfortunately, it's another forgettable X-Men movie following the phenomenal Days of Future Past. So disappointing how they ended this franchise, but let's get it going. So getting into the premise, this is a pretty unique kind of state that the X-Men are in because they have become legitimate public superheroes and celebrities, very similar to like the Avengers. They're taking a lot of the actual MCU directions for some of these characters, and so they start the movie with a rescue mission in space, and Jean Grey absorbs an incredibly powerful cosmic force. They didn't even show how she got this power in The Last Stand, so I do really appreciate that they kind of took the time to do that, took the time to give Jean Grey some backstory. That's very much appreciated. Now, obviously, in terms of specifics, I will get into all that when I get into it, but the cosmic force massively amplifies her abilities while destabilizing her emotionally and making it so she can't really control her powers. Jean begins uncovering suppressed memory from her childhood and learns Charles hasn't been completely honest with her in terms of his work on her upbringing, all of this stuff. Her increasing instability divides the X-Men. Meanwhile, the alien Dabari, led by Vuk, want Jean's cosmic power for themselves. Essentially another adaptation of the Dark Phoenix storyline after The Last Stand, except Jean is unquestionably the centerpiece this time, and they actually do, again, take an interesting direction. So getting into the good, I think Jean Grey is considerably better utilized. I think she makes a very big improvement, and again, she has to be the first thing we talk about because this is her movie. This is the Jean Grey movie in the X-Men franchise. Sophie Turner improves simply from finally having substantial material. They finally give her something to do. I think last movie she was just kind of poorly executed because they kind of threw her to the background. Now, obviously, they were building up to her having that big moment in the end, but by then I was so uninterested. So it didn't really matter what they threw at me in the last movie. Some of that was Jean Grey's fault. Some of it was. Jean actually feels like the main character rather than set up for something later, and she even feels like a bigger main character in this movie than Famke Janssen felt in Last Stand, which is really cool to me. Her childhood trauma and suppressed memories give the story a legitimate emotional foundation. There is some emotion there. There's some fucked up thing. You can kind of get behind her cause, and even if her powers are out of control and she's out of her element and not acting the way she's supposed to, it's understandable. Losing control of increasingly ridiculous power works. From a pure Dark Phoenix story perspective, arguably handled better than The Last Stand. I still prefer Famke Janssen overall, and her Phoenix felt more imposing. Professor X actually becomes flawed. I actually kind of like what they did with Professor X's character in this movie. McAvoy is obviously solid in the role again. It's interesting seeing the X-Men become celebrities with like this merchandise, media appearances, children idolizing them when they get off the plane after the space mission. It's almost a much less satirical version of something the boys would explore. Charles enjoys the acceptance and publicity and starts making questionable decisions because of it. Now, obviously, celebrity and fame can change a lot of people, and the ego gets to him, and I think the movie does a fun job at kind of showing that here. Hiding Jean's memories makes him look legitimately manipulative. It's a nice change from portraying Xavier as the endlessly righteous leader and this super wise and smart guy with all these experiments and all the research he has on the mutants in his school. And Mystique has become one of the strongest characters of this younger generation. I loved Mystique in this movie, debatably her best movie. Rebecca Romijn, Jennifer Lawrence, both. The version ultimately worked really well across these movies. I really liked what they did with Mystique. Her transition from mischievous outsider to respected X-Men leader, that's so fucking cool to me. I think that it was very well executed in this movie as well. It's one of the more well executed things that this movie throws at you. Her frustration with Xavier even makes sense. Her death actually carries some weight because she's one of the characters you've grown to kind of like throughout these movies. This is a hero. This is a face of the X-Men. Jean accidentally killing her is a legitimately interesting consequence of Phoenix. Killing an established character helps establish that Jean genuinely cannot control what she's becoming, and Beast's reaction creates an interesting conflict. And Beast is another character I think is pretty well executed in this movie. Holt continues to work on the role. Nicholas Holt is awesome. Beast being so devastated and overrated Raven that he's willing to work with Magneto to kill Jean, when at the beginning of the movie, like, he was willing to help her, he was willing to, like, check up on her and all this stuff. That's pretty brash. Maybe too brash in execution, maybe a little too sudden for him to be like, all right, let's kill this bitch. But I still like the idea of grief completely fracturing the X-Men into different factions, and you have these different romance partners and all of this stuff, these different groups that are kind of divided on this Phoenix anomaly. Fassbender remains good as Magneto. I think Magneto was a pretty good one here. Not remotely his best performance in the franchise, definitely better than what he did in Apocalypse. The Mutant Refuge, though, is an interesting development for Eric. I really like where they took that. Raven's death gives him an understandable reason to turn against Jean. The Charles and Eric dynamic is familiar territory by now. Obviously, we've had, like, what, 9 or 10 movies to explore that, but McAvoy and Fassbender still make it work. I think the Dabari in concept are actually really cool. Now, they weren't executed in the greatest way in the world, but aliens feel strange, obviously, naturally within the X-Men movies, but in a way, I like it considerably more than the ancient Egypt aesthetic of Apocalypse. Now, I kind of had the same reaction as I did to that once they started introducing aliens, but I think it was actually really cool. I think it actually ended up being a pretty cool kind of element. The space opening gives the franchise a completely different scale. The intergalactic comic book shit is naturally fun, similar to Guardians of the Galaxy. Vuk wanting Jean's power to rebuild her civilization is generic, but it had potential here. They didn't really realize it, but that's fine. The sinister music surrounding Vuk was one of the more distinct elements of that side of the movie as well. Jessica Chastain looks genuinely creepy in the role. There's a much better villain hiding inside this character, but still, it was fine. And Scott and Jean finally feel like an actual couple. I kind of like the romance and how they handled that. Ty Sheridan doesn't necessarily improve, but he doesn't regress either. The chemistry with Sophie Turner works, and the relationship feels more established here. That's all I got. So getting into the battle, when I said the Dabari concept is good, I didn't really mention the execution. The execution of it is ridiculously undercooked. They didn't seem to really give a shit about the Dabari in this movie, even though they seem to be the true villains. Even though Phoenix is taking over, it's rooted in the Dabari, and that's what they want. It's a cool idea without nearly enough development. Obviously, Jessica Chastain is absolutely wasted because she's a pretty damn good actress. Again, someone like Oscar Isaac that I'm not super familiar with, but she has been in so many things. Vuk is slightly better than Apocalypse, though, almost by default, just because Apocalypse is such a shitty character, such a shitty villain in execution. If Vuk received Apocalypse's screen presence with this character concept, she potentially could have been a legitimately good villain, and honestly could have been one of the best villains in the entire franchise just because of how good Jessica Chastain is. They get all of these really good actors and actresses in these villain roles and introduce them to the world of the X-Men, and something happens. It's happened the last 2 movies. Now, obviously, William Stryker with Brian Cox was amazing, but the last 2 times they've tried it, it sucks. Jean is already enough of a threat that the movie arguably didn't even need another villain. Throw her a bone. Throw Jessica Chastain a bone. Give her some script. Come on. The CGI is pretty rough. It doesn't look bad, but it's possibly even worse than Apocalypse in certain places just in how it was utilized. Nightcrawler, it does look kind of bad. Like, Nightcrawler took a noticeably visible downgrade. Jean's massive power displays don't always look convincing. That looks pretty fucking goofy, like you're watching the Shark Boy movie. I can't remember what that movie was called. There's too much artificial spectacle. Like, it kind of regresses back to the same problems that you see in Apocalypse. There's too much going on there. For a movie built around one of the most powerful mutants imaginable, the effects needed to be considerably better. I think Simon Kinberg is definitely inexperienced as a director. I definitely don't think the direction in this movie is all that good. It's not an especially memorable looking film. It doesn't look terrible. It's not a complete turnoff for me, but the cinematography does very little. There's not a whole lot of memorable shots. There's not a whole lot of memorable scenes. The action is slightly better than Apocalypse. Nothing stands out, and I mean, that's not really saying much. There's no sequence I'm walking away desperate to rewatch. And maybe that's because, again, I'm not super big into the X-Men, even though this franchise has made me way more of a fan than I was prior. Compare that to Singer, though, given, like, the White House attack in X2, Quicksilver's Pentagon sequence, the entirety of Days of Future Past, it just doesn't hold a fucking candle to it. And again, when I talked about the undercooked stuff with the Dabari, that's not the only thing. There are so many underdeveloped things in this movie. Beast abruptly decides Jean needs to die. I'm just going to give you some examples. Magneto switches directions. I mean, the Dabari, all that. Jean's transformation happens. Xavier's mistakes get exposed. Mystique dies. Like, there's enough material here for a richer movie than what was actually made, and somehow it simultaneously felt undercooked, but it also felt longer than necessary. I'm not even really sure how they accomplished that, but they did. I think the Quicksilver slow motion thing, like, come on. There's a lot of things you can roll your eyes at in this fucking movie. The slow motion, it's a gimmick. I mean, come on. It was amazing in Days of Future Past. It was still fun in Apocalypse, but like, come on. We get it. We don't need to see the same damn sequence with Quicksilver every damn movie. We gotta stop trying to recreate and rehash. It's getting a little old. So getting into the okay, I'm overall pretty mixed on like the action. It's definitely an improvement over Apocalypse, but it is barely memorable. There's a couple scenes. The train sequence is fine, and the space rescue is pretty cool. The powers have some sort of spectacle, and Jean absorbing the cosmic force works. It's a pretty inciting event to the movie to really like kickstart where we're going, but nothing here approaches the franchise's best action. It's still probably in the bottom like quarter of action in this franchise. The younger X-Men, I remain mixed on them. I'm still not a huge fan of this young cast. I mean, Sophie Turner improves. Ty Sheridan just remains He just remains fine as Cyclops. Cody Smith-McPhee's Nightcrawler works as kind of a background player. Storm remains secondary, but again, I'm not a really big fan of her rendition here either. Like, why the fuck couldn't Halle Berry just put a young filter on and go through there? I don't know. Not everyone needs Avengers level importance. Not everyone needs to be this major character, but I obviously prefer the younger Beast and Mystique. I guess that's the positive I could give this group. That's why it's mixed. It's not overwhelming that everyone is just trash, but I still prefer the original Cyclops and Jean. I will throw that out there. The ending works. I guess we could talk about the ending. There's not a lot to talk about in the okay, and there's not a lot to talk about in this movie in general. It works. It's not really a finale, though. I mean, this kind of feels like they fucking failed with Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix, and now they're like, okay, we're just gonna scrap this damn thing and move on, and if someone wants to pick it up, which obviously 8 years later now, someone ended up doing it naturally with Avengers Doomsday, they did it. So Jean's sacrifice is functional. Phoenix imagery leaves the door open, I guess. They're obviously not going to make any more movies here because they're already planning the reboot. They already had the casting call. They had all the shows where they brought people out in the audience and like showed the cast. Charles and Eric playing chess together provides appropriate full circle imagery, even though it's a little corny, a little repetitive, and that's a lot of things I could say about a lot of the movies in this franchise. But renaming the school after Jean, that's fucking silly. I mean, I don't know if they did that in the comic books. That is goofy as shit. The biggest issue, though, this clearly wasn't constructed as the grand conclusion to 20 years of X-Men movies. It feels like a movie that happened to become the finale because this version of the franchise was finished and it didn't do fucking well. People do not fuck with this movie. This is one of the worst reviewed movies of all Marvel Studio movies, even though I don't think this is a terrible movie. Okay, I don't fucking know what else to say. Again, some of the acting, some of the spectacle, it's goofy as shit. I think they kind of wore themselves thin at this point, but whatever. So getting into my review, Dark Phoenix is more interesting than it is good. That's probably the simplest description of the entire movie. Unlike Apocalypse, there were actual story decisions I wanted to engage with. Jean's childhood, Xavier manipulating her memories, X-Men becoming celebrities, Mystique dying, Beast siding with Magneto, Jean becoming dangerous enough that her own family doesn't know whether to save or kill her, aliens entering the X-Men universe. There's some cool shit in this movie from a story standpoint. Unfortunately, almost every interesting concept feels like it needed another draft. Vuk especially feels like half of a character. The CGI isn't good enough, the action isn't memorable, the filmmaking isn't distinctive, the third act loses my attention once again, and after First Class, and especially Days of Future Past, it's disappointing that this younger era fizzled out with the Apocalypse to Dark Phoenix film. I don't completely understand the nuclear level hatred this movie received. It's bad to mediocre, not some unwatchable cinematic abomination. Apocalypse irritated me considerably more. The Last Stand is still the better movie, despite this arguably doing more with the actual Phoenix storyline. And ultimately, it's another lower tier X-Men movie that I'll probably remember more for its ideas. I'm giving it a 5.8 out of 10. That is not near as bad, a whole tier or two higher than what a lot of people would be willing to give this movie. I think it's a hair worse than X-Men Origins Wolverine, but it is, as it stands, the second worst X-Men movie. It is not worse than Apocalypse. I don't want to fucking hear it from anyone. So that being said, that is going to do it for the video. I'm actually getting ready to post the Letterboxd reviews. If you guys are following me there, GZTV does reviews. I don't really have it on my follow social. Leave a like, comment, subscribe, follow the socials, do all that stuff. GZTV. Have a good rest of your day, night, whenever you're watching. About to get a new desk. But up next, we're done with the X-Men, so we're going to be moving on to the Blade trilogy and then Killers of the Flower Moon. There might be some theatrical releases between now and Clayface that I want to check out, but as of now, going to do it for a while.